Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Runners Roundtable. Season 5 is all about hot takes. And I feel like I say this at the beginning of every episode, and it's just true. I'm so excited to have these conversations and to find people that are willing to speak to me about different topics that I want to explore more. And this episode, I am joined by my very own pelvic floor specialist, pelvic floor PT, just all around great human being, Dr. Ari Gonzalez. And you and I have had so many great conversations just when it's one on one working together. And I've just constantly been thinking about how else can I get people to hear what you have to say, to learn what I've learned. And I figure a podcast is the best place to be. The title of this podcast is going to be called Don't Pee on Yourself. So I think that's a great place to start. I always start these episodes with asking you to introduce yourself to us and then tell us a little bit. I feel like it's going to be, you're going to have a more unique answer than other people. So it's introduce yourself to us, and then also just tell us, what is your relationship to running right now?
Okay, all right. So I am Dr. Ari. I am, like Steph said, a pelvic floor physical therapist. I got my doctorate in physical therapy, and I wasn't initially, oh, let me specialize in pelvic floor. It was more like, oh, I had an interest in school more so, and I spoke to Steph about this last week. They covered pelvic floor like in PT school in less than 10 minutes. And I was kind of like, why is that? Like why it seemed like such an important issue. And the fact that we dedicated almost no time in our curriculum made me kind of like spark that interest. And I was like, okay, in the back of my head, let me just survive grad school and like we'll come back to it. So when grad school was over, I started working. I was mainly in an orthopedic and sports setting. And I started seeing women coming in and, built that rapport with my patients, and they would like confide in me, like, oh, I'm having this issue. Like, what do you think? And like so many women had pelvic floor dysfunction, and I didn't have where to refer them. Like, I didn't know what to do. I felt so bad. I was like, these are my patients. I'm supposed to take care of them, and I don't have the answers for them, and I don't even know where to begin to send these patients to. So that kind of sent me down the rabbit hole of looking into these certifications, and then being like, well, like I could be the person that helps these women. Like, why not? And it all started there. But other than that, I'm 27 years old. I grew up in Miami. I left only for a short bit, lived in Boston for grad school, and I'm back. The weather and I were just, we didn't agree with each other in Boston. But I'm happy to be back in Miami, closer to family and just in the warm, sunny weather. And my relationship to running. Okay, so really interesting. I used to run like probably back in high school, like never more than like 3.5 miles, if I'm being honest. But just kind of recreationally, just for exercise. And I kind of stopped completely for years. Um, and then would like kind of pick it up for a little bit, drop it again, like whatever my interest. I always had an interest in exercise, clearly physical therapist, but I would I would kind of like pick it up on and off. And then more recently, I signed up for a 5K, like what's that called, like an obstacle race.
Mm-hmm.
And that's coming up in May. It's called the Mud Girl Run. So I'm excited. I need to start probably doing some training specific to it, but it's more for fun. I signed up with one of my best friends, and it's a very special cause to me because my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer like maybe 2 years ago. She's doing great, but this run raises awareness and raises funds for breast cancer research, and it's an all women's run. The idea is to go out there, have fun, wear pink, and it's also like it's really nice because it's like an obstacle race. So it's supposed, usually people associate that with men, and I think this is more a chance for all like women of all ages to get out there and get money.
Yeah, that's awesome. That I feel like was part of my entry into running, was doing the obstacle course races. So my first year of running, I did, oh my God, Tough Mudder, like the big names in obstacle course racing. I did them and some
Okay.
smaller local races, and it was just so much fun. Listen, I needed to be helped to like climb walls. Like I would just remember doing some of those races and having like other people on the course. Like the camaraderie was so amazing. There would be other people on the course that would help like throw me over the wall or help
That's
me
amazing.
climb. Yeah, so it really is, it's such a fun way to be active and get the running in without it being so, I think, boring for a lot of people, right? For a lot of people, running without a target can be really boring and they don't see the point. So I find for me, that was one of those things that really got me into it, where I was like, oh, I can run and I can do these things. And then I feel like at least the obstacle course races kind of went down in popularity and now maybe they're coming back. So I'm really excited for you to do that because I think it'll be fun and also just meaningful and give purpose behind your runs and whatever workouts you do. Um, I want to go back and just tell everyone how I met you because I actually met you at the yoga studio that I teach at. You came in and you did a presentation on pelvic floor and yoga, but my brain is constantly thinking about running and how do I improve myself as a runner? And there were so many things that you shared in that presentation that really clicked for me and made me realize that, and I'm going to quote you here, that just because something is common doesn't mean it's normal. Because listening to that presentation, I was like, what? You mean I can get through a run and not pee on myself? Like that's possible. I just thought it was, something that happened. And going back even further, and I've shared this before on the podcast, that I started running when my daughters were 2.5 years old and 6 months old. And at that time, I didn't realize that I was technically still postpartum. Like, yes, I knew I was postpartum because I had a baby, but I didn't realize my body was still in that postpartum phase when I ran. So I had a very weak pelvic floor because back in 2012, no one was talking about pelvic floor. No one, I mean, you would just get the 6 weeks checkup and you're cleared. And it's like, but what does that mean? Like, what is it? Oh, I can just go back. So I started running when she was 6 months old. And very soon after running, I realized, oh, I can't run that far without peeing myself. So I would always wear a panty liner or a pad or something like that. And I probably wore either a panty liner or a pad for that first year where I was running. And it was one of those things where it was such a security blanket for myself of I did not feel comfortable going out for a run unless I had something because I just didn't know if I was going to pee myself, if I was going to cough while I was running and pee myself, if I was going to sneeze while I was running and pee myself, if I was going to laugh too hard while I was running, or in most cases as well, if I'm doing a speed workout where the effort and like I'm running harder, landing harder, like all of these things. And I can vividly remember the process of weaning myself from not using a pad on my runs. And I just thought
Oh,
that was normal, right? Like I thought that was normal. And even the following, at this point, you and I started working together in 2023. So we're talking about for the
like
first
10 years,
11 years,
11
yeah, where
years.
I just thought like, I just thought, hey, 11, 12 years. Oh my God. Yeah. Okay. So 12,
Yeah.
where I just thought that that peeing on myself was something I did. And I still am, because there's a huge mental component. That person that I'm like, if I'm gonna go run, I need to get one more pee in. Like just one more. I just need to squeeze out what I need to out in order to go for my run. And in listening to your presentation, I realized, oh snap, that doesn't have to be part of the story. Like that doesn't have to be something that I stress out a lot. So I'm curious for you, as someone who's in the field, and who's hopefully starting to see more dialogue when it comes to pelvic floor health, what has that change been for you? Because again, for me, back in 2010, 2012, when I had my children, I had no clue what the hell pelvic floor was. I had no clue. I just thought peeing on yourself was normal, and that was just part of it. Do you find that that's changing now?
I think it's really starting to change. And I think a big reason is social media. So at least this is my take, but I think there's been such a growth of people sharing their stories, sharing their experiences. Whereas back then it was so taboo, it was like maybe you would tell your best friend or your mom, and then even if you did, it'd be like, oh, well, like me too, like it's normal. It was like a very like hush hush kind of conversation. I think even when you bring it up to your doctors, a lot of them even now don't really have answers. So they almost normalize it as well, to an extent. Sometimes I think now we're seeing more of a push where some OB-GYNs are saying, oh, well, like look for a pelvic floor therapist, or they can refer you to one, right? There's that connection is building, but it's still not, I wish it were different, but it's still not 100%. I still get patients, and we were talking about this the other day where I kind of get two different pools of patients. I get patients that are a little bit older that maybe had their babies 12 years ago, 15 years ago, who have been like, oh, I wish someone would have told me, even 6 years ago, 5 years ago, like not too long ago.
Mhm.
Or like, I just thought this was normal. Like I've been living like this. And they're so amazed because that first visit is always like very intimidating, and they almost like, I love seeing the change in a patient's face. Usually, with you, I had a different experience. I met you at that presentation. So we had a little bit of conversation prior, but with most patients, they're kind of like their friend maybe told them to come, or they looked it up online or saw it on Instagram, and then they like found their nearest, specialist, near them. And so when they come into that first visit, they're like pretty skeptical, and the change within that hour that I'm with them, where suddenly now they have hope that things can be different, is so special. And then kind of seeing them through their care, right? Because every patient's care can sometimes it's an easier fix, sometimes it takes a couple months of work. It just depends. And just seeing them finally achieve those goals is like, oh my God, like I didn't think like this would be possible. And their other comment is, I wish someone had told me sooner, I would have done this, you know? So it is starting to change. I am seeing newer moms like fresh postpartum at that 6 week point, their doctor either told them to come, which I want to say is on the lesser. Like most of them heard of it either from a friend, from their sister, or from like online. Like I think social media makes a big change because like maybe they follow an influencer who mentioned that they did pelvic floor PT, or they, whoever, some like people are talking about it more. And I think that's what's changing. I think for so long when, as women, I think we tend to stay quiet and just kind of like not ask for help. I think we have a harder time asking for help. And I think that was a big part of it, right? Like especially in the postpartum phase, I feel like you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to keep the baby alive. You're just trying to remember to eat, like basic things. Like you're running on so little sleep, and your whole life just got turned upside down. I think, especially then, like women don't really find that in them to then be like, oh, but I matter too. Like I'm experiencing all these things too. Like I need care. I need someone to take care of me. But I think more and more women are feeling more empowered to do that, which I think is amazing. Um, so I do think it's changing. I hope it becomes my like ultimate dream is that it becomes like routine, like right, like you know with surgery. You come out of a surgery and your doctor's immediately handing you a script for PT, is telling you, hey, this is going to be your protocol. Like, I want you to follow up with me in this many weeks and this, and that. And there's like a plan in place for you. Like, you don't have to second guess, like, okay, like, I just had this knee surgery and like, what do I
Yeah.
do? Like, but with pregnancy and postpartum, there's no guidance, right? It's almost like, and this is a sentiment I hear from almost all the moms I treat, if not all of them, that they're kind of like, oh, I feel like during the pregnancy, it was like check up here, check up there. Everyone was like making sure I was feeling okay, all these things. And suddenly, like, I have the baby, and it's like, okay, like, bye, like, you're on your own, And at that 6 week mark, like you mentioned, that appointment is so frustrating for so many moms because they go in and they're expecting their doctor to do maybe um, like have a conversation with them and explain to them what comes next, and they have all these questions, and a lot of them feel like, oh well, like he just cleared me, but like cleared me for what? What does that mean? That 6 week clearance, I think, for a lot of women is, or for a lot of moms, is so like confusing. They're like, what am I allowed to do? Like, okay, I can exercise, but I used to run marathons. Like, can I run a marathon this year? Like, should I start training for that?
Yeah, I heard someone, this was after I had children, again, like that I wish someone would have told me that that 6 week postpartum appointment, what the purpose of that appointment is really to confirm that you're healing as expected. It's not that you're ready to return to normal activity. It's just that your body is healing as it should be at 6 weeks. And I can listen, as a woman who has had children and who has experienced that firsthand, and even now as a woman in her 40s, I have like similar frustrations, but different because, yes, when I was pregnant, there were so many different care providers checking in on me, making sure I'm doing well, and then have my babies. And I go to my 6 week postpartum and they're like, okay, you're good to go. We'll see you at your annual checkup. And it's like, no one's checking up on me anymore, but I do have to take my baby to the doctor every month. So it's like, the focus shifts from me to the baby. And then now, like my current frustration is very much so that there was more interest in my health when I was reproductive than it is right now as someone who has a lot of questions about perimenopause and menopause and what does it all mean to be an aging woman. So I definitely find that the medical community, there's the attention to women's health is just interesting, and it feels backwards considering we spend the majority of our lives not being reproductive, right? Like there is a good chunk of life spent where we're not having babies and where we're not, yeah, we're not having babies. So brings me back to your presentation, and part of why I reached out to you to work with you is because you helped dispel this myth that I was too old to get help. And by too old, it's not that I'm saying like I'm old, but it's more of like this problem is so old that I can't get help. And your presentation, you're like, no, you can do it whenever. And then also, which just blew my mind because again, I'm living in a female body and it's like I'm living in a female body and I don't know what the hell's going on. But you had said that menopause, that is something that can, I don't want to say exacerbate, but if there's pelvic floor issues, that menopause is also a stage of life where you might have even more issues with your pelvic floor. And that again blew my mind because I was like, wait, what? So like this issue that I've been dealing with could possibly get worse, but also I can still do something about it. So can you, I guess, just in your words, what would you say to someone who says, "Oh no, it's too old," or "I've been dealing with this problem for so long, it can't change. Like nothing can change it. I've tried Kegels and it doesn't work." So what would you say to that?
You said that on purpose.
I did.
Okay. So it's a big question to break down. So what would I say? One, I strongly believe you're never too old to get these issues addressed, right? Um, will the recovery maybe look different? Yes. Is there an optimal time to come in? Yes. Definitely I'd recommend for anyone in that early postpartum phase to come in earlier than not. But does that mean that, my patients that are a little older, maybe had their kids a couple years back, or are in the midst of perimenopause, menopause, like are they a lost cause? Absolutely not. I I work with women of all ages. the best way to say it is I think pelvic floor therapy is something that will be helpful for women throughout the life cycle. You know, it's not just, oh, during these prime years where you're reproductive and this and that. Like, absolutely not. You know, and some women, I've had a lot of patients actually, you know, who maybe had their kids even way before that. Maybe they're in their 60s or 70s now. And maybe at the time, they didn't actually have any symptoms. They didn't have any urinary leakage. They didn't have any, um, discomfort, pelvic pain, prolapse, any of that. But then now in their 60s or 70s, they're starting to have those symptoms. And then that's what we were talking about, where it's not that these symptoms came out of nowhere. Because I've had, patients ask me, like, I don't get it. I had my kids so long ago. Like, I never had anything. I was fine. I recovered. I went back to my life. And then obviously none of this was talked about back then, but it was never an issue for them. It wasn't something that, they've been dealing with quietly until they turned 70 and now they're in my office. It's something that all of a sudden in their 70s, they're having this issue. And they're like, what's going on? And well, we know that once we turn 30 and past our 30s, we lose muscle mass. So imagine you go through pregnancy, birth, all of that, whether that's C-section or vaginal, in your mid, late 20s, early 30s, whatever. You lose so much muscle during pregnancy and you affect your pelvic floor musculature so much throughout pregnancy and during delivery. And then you have your natural decline as a human being of losing muscle. And then add in, once menopause kicks in, all the hormonal changes that happen. So you have a recipe for disaster in the sense that, you didn't address it then, or maybe there was no issue then, but there was still weakness, right? So, just because you don't have symptoms doesn't mean you didn't lose muscle and your body wasn't affected. And then you go through life, maybe you had no symptoms, maybe you had minor symptoms, and then suddenly menopause comes. And those symptoms suddenly become so much worse. Now it's not just, oh, if I get really, really sick and I'm just like coughing like crazy, and by that like fifth or sixth cough, like I leak a little bit. No, now it's every time I sneeze, every time I cough. I have allergies, so it happens to me every morning. Like it starts becoming a daily problem, versus this like, oh, it kind of happens like maybe once a month, every 2 months. Like I can live that way, right? And that's the thing. I think we have this very core issue as women for the most part, where we're like, I'm not dying. Like
Yeah.
I need to be a caregiver. I have the kids to worry about. I have my husband or wife to worry about. And then I'm kind of putting myself on the back burner. And so a lot of women have either put themselves on the back burner until it becomes such an issue that they need to seek help, or maybe it was a therapy that wasn't available to them, and now they're learning about it later in life. So I I definitely will emphasize it's not too late. I've seen women as old as 70, 80 plus have significant improvement in their symptoms. Um, Sometimes it fully resolves. Sometimes, it goes from being a really big issue to something more manageable. Um, I just, I would never encourage women to just give up and just say, well, I'm going to live this way. Um, I, I, I think it's important to always prioritize yourself and don't let yourself kind of be put on the back burner just because you're being an amazing mom or caregiver. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's so two things that I want to say is that I feel like our society has normalized sneeze and squirt, right? Like the cough and
Yeah.
squirt, like, oops, I leak, oops. Like it's so normalized in our society. I mean, it's almost like a joke at times where it's like I feel like I've seen sketches or just where it's like, oh, I sneezed and I peed myself. Oops. And it's like, okay, so even if we're seeing that, we're thinking that's again, like to use your language, where we're assuming it's normal, but it's not normal just because it's common. It's not normal. So there's that piece of society just like that's part of the female experience. But also I want to, because I wrote it down because I found it to be so eye-opening for me, right? You're talking about the compounding effects of being a woman in the body, where it's pregnancy weakens those muscles, then we have normal muscle loss, and then on top of that, hormonal changes. So it's almost like there, I feel, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but it's like it seems more accurate to say that every single woman at some point in their life is going to have an issue with their pelvic floor, especially if you're going through like I had my children in my 20s. So it's like, okay, I'm going into my 30s with a weakened pelvic floor. And in my 30s is when I start to lose mass. And then, so it's just, to me, it just seems like it's part of the female experience. And yet for whatever patriarchal funding BS that there is out there, it is not part of our standard of care. And that just kind of like, I mean, that angers me. That angers
Yeah.
me. And
I
that
think
also just,
it should anger all women, right? Like that exact sentence that you said about it's more likely that all women will experience some form of pelvic floor dysfunction. You're absolutely right. I had an OB-GYN tell me that same sentence, you know, a male OB-GYN. And so I just think it should be more normalized, it should be more talked about, and it should be a standard of care for women. And it's not, it's something you either have to advocate for yourself or find on your own, um, or educate yourself on your own. And then I truly, even within my own patient population that I'm treating, I find that I'm more likely to get a referral from other patients who've now worked with me, see the benefits, see the improvements, and then will tell their friends because I feel like that's how I feel like that's how this is growing, the knowledge of this. It's more like more women are sharing with other women about, hey, this was life changing for me. This was like made a huge change in my life. I can now play my sport actually focusing on my sport, or I can just go about my day to day and like I don't have to worry about where the nearest bathroom is or how like if I peed recently and what if my friend makes me laugh over coffee and I just happen to leak a little bit and it's becoming more talked about, but I hope to see in the years coming that it becomes just a standard of care because it should be, and as women I think we should be upset. I think we should be angry that it's not.
yeah, I mean, listen, I have a lot of anger towards patriarchy. So it's like there was a couple of months ago where my oldest daughter, she was like, it, there was something about the patriarchy came up, and she was like, you are so pro woman and like amplifying the voices of women. She's like, I'm surprised you marry a man, like you married a man. And I'm just like, that's not like, it's two different things. Like,
It doesn't have
it's,
to. That's so funny.
but that was her thing. And I'm like, well, I'm like, yes, I married a man. I love your dad. And it's like, but it's also, listen, he's in the trenches with me, being married to me, that's constantly questioning things. And then we're raising daughters who we are raising them to constantly question things as well. So it's, having at least with my husband and talking to him about things, like there's also so much that he doesn't get and he doesn't understand because women don't talk about it. And there's a lot. So there is a lot of power in including men in the conversation,
I agree.
because sometimes they don't listen to us ladies when we're talking. When we're screaming, they may not listen to us, but a man who talks calmly like might get more attention. So it's doesn't make sense to me. And those are just, listen, those are other issues. But coming back to this, I wanted to share with everybody here the process of, I guess, just
Okay.
what was like that first session with you. And I'll say for me, what I was impressed with in the beginning was the power of the breath and core engagement. And even then, how working pelvic floor really is working the entire body. So that was my experience. But for you in general, when you do your initial session with someone, what does that look like?
I always tell people there will be a lot of talking during that first session. So I do think the most important piece of that first session with someone is letting them tell their story. So letting them share with me, even if it dates back to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, like where did this all begin and what has been the progression since, and sometimes like even the most like the tiniest details are actually so important. So a lot of these patients don't really get to tell their whole story, and a lot of providers, sadly, with the way our medical system works, like they don't have the time, and even if they want to, right, it's just the way our system is built. They don't have the time to sit with someone and let them talk for almost an hour. Like I will say, like majority of my first session with someone is I will take up the whole hour if I need to, of just taking history if it's warranted, right? Um, I want to know about everything. I want to know about any symptoms you're having. I want to know when they started. I want to know, about symptoms that you might not even think are connected, right? So we kind of cover all the bases urinary wise, bowel wise, and also sexual function. It's something that, they all play a role. And I almost find that history tells me so much more about what could be going on with someone than their actual physical exam, right? I found out about whether they have a history of sexual abuse. I find out about if they have a history of chronic UTIs, yeast infections, other conditions, and even outside the pelvis, right? So I find out about what their sport is, what their past injuries were. Did they sprain an ankle a year ago? And that might seem unrelated, but it's really not. So I definitely treat from a point of the patient first, and I'm not your typical pelvic floor therapist in that I just kind of zero in on the pelvis. I do have an orthopedic and sports background, and I think that really lets me think outside the pelvis. So I look at you as your whole body, like you said, and so I think a lot of people have the misconception that they're going to go to pelvic floor PT and they're just going to do a bunch of Kegels, and they're just going to do a lot of core work. And if they just go to Pilates, it'll be basically the same thing. And it's not. I can guarantee you it's not because a lot of times people do Kegels thinking that that's what's going to help and they make the issue worse. So the benefit of going to a pelvic floor therapist is that they're going to examine you, they're going to listen to your whole story, put the pieces together, and then they're going to do the physical exam and they should look at your whole body, um, and kind of see how things are playing a role. So if your ankle mobility is lacking, then maybe when you land on your runs, that's putting more like pressure on the pelvic floor. There's different things that they should be taking into account. If you have a previous knee injury, well, is that like weaker than the other? And how is that affecting your pelvic floor? So they should be addressing the whole body. So that's one of the biggest things. But sometimes I literally have spent a first session and just completely talked the whole time to a patient because they had just such an intense history, and such a rich history of what was going on that I felt that was warranted. And then we didn't actually reach the physical exam until the second session. And I think that's valid, you know?
That's so valid. And I even wrote it down here because I was like, one of the things I've learned from working with you is the mental side of it, right? And as I shared at the beginning of our conversation, like my mental default is I have to pee before I go. Like I've already created that story for myself of like, I have to pee. And if I don't pee, then I'm going to start thinking about how much I have to pee because I didn't pee. And then I'm actually going to have to pee. So like breaking
Yeah.
down those stories is so incredibly helpful because, and again, for me, in talking to you, it was realizing that all these things that I declared for myself as normal were not normal. And there is some grief involved in that, in thinking, wait a minute, for the past 10 years, I've told myself it's okay to pee on myself when, yeah, I mean, it's okay. I guess if it happens, it happens. But it's like, I've been shortchanging myself a positive experience because the story I've been telling myself is that this is just how it is. And this is just what my body does. And there is a little bit of, there's a lot of grief, depending on who you are, in realizing that. And there, for me, I did the examination, and I remember when you're like, do you want to do it? I'm like, heck yeah. I'm like, if we're going down this road, like we're going to do all of it. And I had the most phenomenal experience, which I will share here on the podcast. And I shared it with my friends. I like texted my closest girlfriends after meeting with you because I had been experiencing hip pain in my left hip. Like I don't even know how to describe where it was, but in the examination, you're like, oh, yes, this is the muscle. I can feel it. Can you feel it? And I was like, yes. And I could feel it felt like ropey, I guess. Like I could just feel that it was tight. And from the internal examination, you released that. And then my runs afterwards, like I remember texting you or you texted me to check in. I don't even remember how it happened, but I was like, holy crap, I feel so much lighter. And I had no clue, like, no clue that
Yeah.
something that I felt outside of my body, like on my, like I felt it was my left hip, that through a pelvic floor examination, you could feel and you could help release. And honestly, there would have been no amount of stretching, no amount of like massage gunning that baby away. Like it would not. And I had been dealing with that hip tightness. It wasn't pain, it was more tightness that bordered on pain, but not so painful that I couldn't run, if that makes sense. I mean, runners
Right.
hearing me speak, you know what I'm talking about when I say like it hurts, but not so much to stop you from running. And it's was absolutely amazing. And I after that, I texted all my girlfriends and I was like, I can't believe I just had this experience. I have to tell you, like it was my hip was released. Like, what in the world? Like, oh my gosh. But again, like it goes back to this lack of education on my part of even understanding that, hey, there are all these muscles in my pelvic floor that are impacted by all these other muscles that are around it. Like our bodies, I really say our bodies are some of the most beautiful, sophisticated technology that exists. Like it really is amazing what our bodies are able to do. And that was a moment for me where I just could not believe it. I was like, wait, what? Like, I have been dealing with this hip stuff for so long.
I remember
And
you were like, this has been going on forever. And I was like, you're like, you're a magician. And I was like, yeah.
it was just amazing. Like, it was absolutely, I like, listen, it was the most incredible thing. I had to text and voice note all my friends afterwards to tell them my experience. So, with that, like, that was my personal experience. Can you just I don't want you to like dive deep into it because I know it's so much information, but what are some of the considerations that us runners in particular, or some of the things that us runners should be aware of when it comes to our pelvic floor?
Okay. So specific to runners, I think, or let's say the female running athlete.
Yeah,
Okay. I think you should be aware of a lot of things. So, one, I really hope that if you're running and training and racing, that you're spending, a considerable amount of time strength training. And I think that is super important because like we were talking about, pelvic floor dysfunction doesn't just come from the pelvis, right? So, Kegels here and there aren't typically going to fix anything. But you have to have strong hips. You have to have strong glutes. You have to have strong hamstrings. I think a lot of runners, maybe not all, but a lot don't like to train, and a lot don't like to train their posterior chain. And I can say that because also working in a sports ortho clinic, that was true also for my male runners. But truthfully, I think we need to spend a considerable amount of time strength training. It's going to help you with overall injury prevention, but it's also going to protect your pelvic floor as a female, as well as, I think if you are a postpartum athlete or thinking of having kids or pregnant right now, whatever stage you're in, if that's your journey, I think knowing that checking in with a pelvic floor therapist should be key and it should be on your to-do list. Um, Whether you're running through pregnancy, I think checking in with a pelvic floor therapist is important so they can make sure you're doing that safely. And then also in postpartum, I think you should definitely, follow up, make sure everything heals well before you pick back up running again. And I know for us runners, I mean, for not us runners, for you runners, it's really hard to stop running, right? Like one of the things I remember as an ortho clinician, I was like, you never tell a runner not to run because
Mm-mm.
they will not come back. They will just, they would just not come back to therapy.
Listen, hey, okay. I mean, I'm telling you, I peed on myself. Like,
Right.
no amount of you telling me stop doing it, or like, if you would have told me, Steph, if you don't want to pee on yourself, stop running, I would have said bye. It was so nice to meet you. Like, cool,
This
I'll
is
deal with
great.
it.
Bye.
Right. So, absolutely, I mean, you're absolutely right. But it's
But I
okay. I
also
want you
think
to
in
finish your thought.
Yeah, so I understand you don't want to tell a runner to stop running, but especially in that early postpartum period, we do want to wait actually 12 weeks before we incorporate high impact. And there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason for that because we want to protect that pelvic floor, even if you're not having symptoms. Like you could have had your baby, gone to your 6 week checkup, seen your pelvic floor therapist, and you're like, I should be good to run. I'm not leaking. I can laugh. I can sneeze. Everything's good. I'm gonna go for a run this weekend. And I'm gonna be like, please don't. And it's not because I'm definitely not the therapist that's gonna keep you from your sport unnecessarily. I want to get you back as soon as possible, but I also want you to be safe. And, those extra couple weeks are just going to give you time to focus on strengthening and rebuilding. I really call that early postpartum phase the rebuilding phase, because we have to rebuild all the muscle we lost. And I don't care how active you were during pregnancy. I promise you, you lost a lot of muscle. And and I can show you, like if you come in and we strength test, you're gonna be like, oh wow, I am really weak. Because, your body is going through all these changes. Hormonally, you're going through all these changes. Your belly's growing, different muscles are lengthening in different ways. Specifically, your glutes, lose a lot of muscle mass. And if you don't get that back and you jump right into your usual activity, you're going to cause dysfunction, even if there's not dysfunction there initially. So you want to kind of prepare yourself, right? You don't go, I don't know, you don't go snorkeling without your gear. You
Yeah.
shouldn't go running postpartum without, making sure everything's ready for that. I don't know. I think, and even for my female runners who are not having babies, right? That's also a big possibility. There's a lot of women who don't have children, and that's not our primary goal in life. Um, I would also suggest that you just monitor how you feel, are aware of signs and symptoms that are not normal, like we talked about. They may be common, but they're not normal. So if you're leaking when you run, if you're having to stick to a specific liquid schedule and bathroom schedule to avoid leaking while you run, if you are having to wear a pad or a panty liner because you're, afraid that that might happen. If you can only run a certain, even if you can run maybe short distances, but maybe you run marathons and after a certain mileage point, you're probably going to leak. That's not normal. And I would encourage you to seek help because help exist and you don't have to live that way. So that's another thing. I think a lot of women, they're like, oh, well, I didn't have kids. Like, why am I having these symptoms? And yes, a pregnancy and, delivering a baby is a high risk factor, but it's not the only reason you can have pelvic floor dysfunction. I treat plenty of women that have never had kids, don't want to have kids, and they still have symptoms. So I wouldn't count yourself out. And and yeah.
Yeah, I go back to like my thought process of just at some point everyone's going to need some help. Any person in a female body is going to need some help with this, and it just so crummy that it's taboo to talk about this in a way, right? Like, I mean, I don't feel like it's taboo because I've been able to talk to you about it. I talk to my friends about it. And in general, I feel like in the running community, I was telling someone the other day, I'm like, everyone has a pee story and everyone has a poop story. Like, we all have them. Like, we all have them. It's just it's part of the experience of being a runner. But it's also like now it's there's that question of, but why is that part of the experience of being a runner? I mean, the pooping one I get because sometimes you have a gel, it doesn't sit well, or you didn't get your, requisite number of poops before you started your run, so then it happens on your run, right? Like I get that. But the peeing one is the one that's like, okay, I understand if there's no bathrooms and you're like, crap, I really have to go. But, and it's happened to me where I will think like it's happened to me before where I, before I leave my house, I pee. And then on my run, I'm like, crap, I feel like I have to pee. Crap, I feel like I have to pee. Crap, I feel like I have to pee. And I feel like I do a pretty good job holding it in. And then there comes a point where it's just like, I can't. And all of a sudden it's not just a trickle, but it feels like it's a full pee. And it's in those moments where I'm like, what the heck? Like, what? I don't understand what I did. But in working with you, it's also been supremely helpful to understand that, and these are things that I hadn't thought about, but triggers for that. So for me, and I'll tell everyone here, for me, I used to do Vega's pre workout, like it was a caffeinated pre workout. And you had said sometimes caffeine can be that thing to irritate. After that, after I heard that, I said, you know what? Let's put the Vega to the side. Let's just try not to have that and see what it happens, like see what happens. And I will say almost immediately, that sensation of having to pee early on in a run went away once I took out the caffeine. And that for me was just, again, like that. My Vega pre workout was something I had been doing for years. And because I had been doing for years, I had normalized that I have to pee, but I hadn't made the connection that maybe drinking that pre workout was the thing that was doing that for me.
And that's the thing. I think a huge part of it, aside from the exercise component, addressing where there's maybe a muscle imbalance, all of that is key as part of the initial eval and like figuring out what's going on. But I think a huge part of it is education. I think you might agree with me on that because I think there's a lot of things we don't know that I think as women we should know. Truthfully, I didn't learn until I started looking into these certifications and started learning about the pelvic floor and our bladder and all of that. But there's bladder irritants, there's certain foods, certain caffeine is definitely a big one. So when you see your pelvic floor therapist or when you're evaluated, that's the reason why the history is also important because they're gonna be like, okay, well, what's your routine? Like, what do you consume before each run? Like, what are you consuming day to day? They might have you fill out a bladder diary where you're writing down, oh, throughout the day, this is what I ate, this is how much water I had, this is when I had my coffee, this is, and you're writing down if you had accidents, what happened, was it a big one, a small one, was I laughing when it happened, was I on a run, did I run a little further that day, whatever it may be, and you're documenting so that your therapist can then look at it and be like, okay, well, I notice you're having caffeine before every single run. Like, what if we try to eliminate that for a little bit and just see what happens? Or I noticed that, I don't know, when you have 5 cups of coffee in a day, you're leaking every other hour versus when you just have your morning coffee, you're absolutely fine. So, it's a lot of like piecing the puzzle together. That's why for everyone it is a little bit different. Um, there's so many education components, even about, bad habits that I think a lot of us, will take. And I even had some of them before I learned better. And so one of the ones I tell my patients all the time is, let's try not to pee just in case.
Yeah.
And everyone will kind of be like, oh yeah, I do that, And the peeing just in case is something that you start doing because you're worried. You're like, okay, well, I'm leaving the house now. I'm gonna run errands. I'm gonna go to Publix, and I have to pick up my kid at school. And I don't know if I'm gonna have a bathroom. And then what if I'm stuck in the car? And so
What
you
if I'm
start
stuck in
overthinking.
traffic?
Yeah, and especially with this Miami traffic. And
Mhm.
so you're like, you know what? I don't really have to pee, but I'm just gonna pee now. Like I'll just get it out of the way now while I'm at home, or before I leave the store, or whatever. And the thing is, you're teaching your bladder bad habits. So that's something like an important piece that I think I cover with patients a lot of times on that first visit, because we do adopt all these bad habits, but it's because we're trying to adapt to the situation, or
Yeah.
trying to facilitate everything being a little bit smoother for ourselves, but we make the issue worse. So a lot of people who have leakage end up having urinary frequency where they're peeing like every other hour because they don't want to leak. So now it's like, oh, but now I pee, like I have to go pee every hour. And I'm like, well, do you really have to pee every hour? Because your bladder should really be able to hold the length of a long movie, like 2.5 to 3 hours. You know, it can vary a little bit, but roughly that time it should be able to hold. And a lot of people are like, what? Like, no way. Like, they're just so mind blown by that. So one of the, biggest things we do is bladder training. And it's like, okay, well, you either have to trust me, and a lot of people have a hard time trusting me after just meeting me once, and they're like, but you're gonna try to resist that urge to go and try to slowly start spacing out your bathroom visits, because that urge to go is a fake urge. You've just taught your body to go that often. Like now your bladder thinks it has to go every hour or every 30 minutes or every 15 minutes, but in reality, it doesn't. It's just, it got used to that pattern. And now we have to get it unused to that and teach it better habits. So I think there's a lot to take away from that first visit education wise. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm laughing just listening to you speak because that's been something I've been working on, right? Like with my runs, like how far can I get into my runs? And I think that's the question I have for you that I'm sure other people who are runners are probably wondering as well, because I find that it's okay to hold my pee for 3 hours if I'm not doing anything that's high impact, or if I'm not doing anything that has required me to carb load and hydrate, say like before a half marathon or a marathon. So, how does that, and again, like specific to the runner, and I'll say for me, like I experienced it recently at the 2 half marathons that I ran in January. Like, I feel like those were I feel like every race is a test, especially because how I carb load and how I prep for my long runs has changed to include more hydration, which I've told you I've started to drink more of my carbs because it just feels better in my body. So I definitely go into the races feeling a little squishier. But what happened in both of those races was that I had to pee, and it was around mile 5, but then I was good the rest of the way, like good. And when I say I had to pee, because before, and it's happened to me where I call them like phantom pees, where it's like I feel like I have to pee and then I go to the bathroom and nothing comes out. So I'm like, what the heck is going on? Like I thought I had to pee. So now it's because I've been working with you, I definitely question the sensation more of like, do I really have to pee, or do I have to pee because I've been moving for X amount of time? And normally, like the past 2 races, it's been like I've peed either because I'm running with someone and they're like, I'm going to go to the bathroom. Then I'm like, okay. But in Arizona, when I ran, it was because I felt like my bladder was hurting. Like I was like, oh, this baby's full. Like it's not just like the, oh, the sensation of like, I think I have to pee, so let me pee. No, this was like, there is pee here, and if you do not let me out, I am going to pee all over you. So
Yeah.
then I peed. So just out of like, I guess what how does that change for us runners, right? Where again, like those we're hydrating more before a run. And then when we're running, like we're pounding, like our bladder and our bodies are getting a workout. So what are some of the things that maybe we can just keep in mind to
Right.
break that pattern of like, oh, I have to pee like that. This is the just in case pee that I have to do to break out of
Yeah.
that.
Right. I think it takes time, and I think you can agree because you have to learn to start listening to your body and knowing what cues to trust. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that takes a lot of time to, it takes some time to figure out. I also think, if you just peed at the start of the race and like not even a mile in, you're having to pee, most likely that's not a true, urge. But it'll take time to figure it out. And I think what I've also learned with working with you is that it also changes based on, oh, I'm just running, at home and my race is coming up versus race day, right? Race day, you're prepping differently, like you mentioned. You're excited, you're nervous, you're maybe shooting for a certain time or a certain goal with your race. So I think all of that's going to influence it. And, I think the goal here isn't to, oh, I'm going to run the entire race and not have to stop. Maybe that's not the goal, maybe it's just like you said. Now I noticed that in the last two races, I had to run around the 5 mile mark and it was a real pee, like my bladder was full. And then I was good the rest of the race. And I remember the biggest takeaway from when we met after those two races was that you were more excited about your metrics during those two races, like your pacing, all of that. Like you were just, that's what you were telling me about. And I was like, okay, this is amazing because now it's not, and then at the race, and then I peed at the hotel, and then I peed again right before, and then I had an urge around this time, but then it went away, and then I peed here. Like that's what like it used to sound like when we used to talk about your races, right? And that's not the case anymore. So I think we talked about that, like how that's overall a win. Like yes, you peed. I'm not. I like that. The goal is for not for you to have like a bladder of steel that can withhold hours and hours and hours, right? Like you are participating in a sport, you're jittery that day, you're fueling differently, you're having far more liquid than you probably normally do. You know, all those factors are going to change and weigh in, and it's not wrong to pee during a race, right? Like that's not the message here. I think the message here is we want to notice when now peeing is becoming disruptive and you're focused during a race and you're noticing that you're having to take all these extra measures to just get through a race and now you're not even enjoying the race because you're just worried about peeing the whole time. Like that's not what we want. And that's when I would say, all right, like let's do something about that. Let's figure out what we can do to make that different. And let's get you to the point where I think Steph is at now, where she's just enjoying her sport again, and that's the real goal.
Oh yeah. Listen, I after Mesa, and I had never done this before because I think part of it was the whole like the bladder and like worrying that I would pee on myself. But like at that half marathon, it was the first race ever in my in my in my 12 and a half year career as a runner that I had a negative split. I ran the second half faster. And it was totally because once I got into that second half, like I didn't worry about my bladder. Whereas I had gotten to a point where I was always very worried about my bladder and peeing and like, can I make it to the bathroom stop? Do I need to stop? Like all of that stuff, because I knew that if I picked up the pace, I would pee on myself. And that was the first race where it was like, wasn't even a concern. Yes, I peed twice in the first 5 miles because my bladder was just screaming at me. But even then, like when I looked at my pacing, I was like, oh, pacing was great. Like I was so solid those 5 miles. And then after that 5 mile mark, I spent the next 8 miles really focusing on my body, being in my body, and trying to negative split that race, I didn't even think about the bathroom anymore. Whereas normally it would have been, my thought process would have been, oh, if I'm going to speed up, let me make sure I hit up the next bathroom so that I don't have to worry about my bladder because I know my bladder is going to talk to me. So it is, I mean, I've learned a lot and it's been very transformative to not only do the physical work that I've been doing with you, but it's also the mental work of really analyzing like, okay, is this because I have to pee? Or am I just really, really excited? And like my bladder is the part that's expressing that excitement because that's something we've talked about as well, where I remember telling you after some of my races, that was my feedback of like, I think I have to pee just because I'm excited. Like I don't even think I really have to pee. I think it's just the excitement of it being race day. And we talked about that. And it was just very illuminating for me to think that, oh, this bladder issue, which I think is just a bodily issue, like, no, there's actually, again, like there's mental stories that go along with
Absolutely.
it that are just incredibly impactful. So want to thank you for that. I have three more questions. I did six, but no, I have three more questions for you. I have three more questions. Question number one is, can you tell us where to find you and where we can better connect with you?
Yeah, so my company's official name is Forma Physiotherapy. I'm actually wearing a t-shirt. Um, and you can find me on my website, www.formaphysiotherapy.com, or on Instagram, Forma Physiotherapy. And you can always DM me there. I have a way for you to message me through WhatsApp there, and we'll get in contact and kind of get started. And what was your second? I feel like I didn't
Second
answer that full.
question, no. I always I say like three questions, but I guess that's why I do the six because there's always like multiple parts to my question. I don't ever ask like a simple question. That was perfect. Second question is, what do you have coming up this year, running related or not, that you are excited about?
Running wise, we did talk about that obstacle course race, which I'm really excited. It's going to be me and a childhood best friend participating. She actually runs and I don't, but I think it'll just be a good time. And not running wise, I'm really excited to keep growing Forma. And I'm looking for ways to increase access to care for all women. So I do understand right now, pelvic floor therapy is not something that's typically covered by insurance. It's a cash-based service. I do practice concierge care, so I come to you and my prices are pretty competitive. At least from what I've heard from most OB-GYNs, they're always really impressed by that. But I want to increase access to care to all women, and I think it's still something that some women can't access very freely. So I'm working on having either some sort of ebook or online format where maybe it's not as personalized in the sense that you're not meeting one-on-one having that formal evaluation, but if you know you're having certain symptoms, it could be I want it to be both educational and then maybe have some exercises for someone to know maybe where to get started to have a jumping off point. So I am working on that. I don't want it to just be like blanket advice you could just find online. I want it to have maybe some form of a history questionnaire where, like, depending on how you answer, you kind of get a program assigned for you. So it could
Mm,
be still a little bit more specific. But yeah, that will be coming hopefully sooner rather than later. And I do want that to be a lower ticket item to just, for more women to have access to care. That's like really my goal in all of this.
I love that. I love that. And I mean, based off of my experience, I think everyone should have the same. So I love that. All right. Final question is, what are your final words for us?
Ooh, so much pressure. I think my final words are for all the women listening, especially my female runners, because I know that's the population that really listens to this podcast. I would say, please don't let yourself be put on the back burner. Get the care you need if you need it. Um, and just know that it's never too late. to get the care you need. I don't care if you're 20 years old or 80 years old. Um, I'm sure there's something we could do to make things better. So I really, really want to emphasize that. I think a lot of women meet with me for the first time, and the thing I hear the most is thank you for giving me hope. So this is me giving you guys hope. I really, really encourage you to seek care and and put yourself first.
The clap. I'm clapping. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave it at that. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.